On the battlefield of Kursk, Russia's propaganda machine is working overtime, trying to cover up its failures, conveniently leaving out any mention of Ukraine's victory near Alexandrovka. Now, last week, 2 Russian tanks were part of just one of dozens of failed counterattacks in that area. Meanwhile, Putin's PR team has been busy mourning towns that Ukraine captured back in late August, as if they just found out. Turns out Russian media was collectively playing dead until Ukraine announced they'd captured over 600 Russian soldiers, forcing Moscow to admit it had sent poorly trained conscripts to the front, triggering elite Russian families to contemplate tearing off the Kremlin's roof in fury. On the ground, Russia has been hurling cab glide bombs left and right in the Kursk region. After all, it's their own land. But back on the front lines inside Ukraine, Russia lacks enough KBs and progress is slowed to a crawl. The best way to deal with these bomb-dropping Russian jets, take out their planes and air bases. The U.S. had planned to deliver ATMS-CMS tactical missiles specifically for this, but for some mysterious reason, the delivery keeps getting delayed. As a result, Russia shifted 90% of its fighter jets out of range, and now the U.S. is using that as an excuse to say, well, since they're out of range, we don't really need to send those missiles after all. But in reality, even hitting the remaining 10% of Russia's air force could be a game changer. Plus, the ATACMS could also target Russian ammo depots and command centers. Washington's hesitation suggests there might be some behind-the-scenes talks with Moscow. Things aren't looking great for Russia. And you can tell by their media's selective blindness. Instead of addressing their losses, they keep shouting that NATO is about to invade Kursk. Apparently, just mentioning NATO magically rallies the Russian people. Clearly, the Putin regime is feeling less and less in control of the situation. Russia has also thrown out a new line: we're not in a rush to take back Kursk, we'll get to it in a few months. Translation: we have no idea how to handle it, so let's just kick that can down the road. On September 5th, Putin even made a bold statement: we're willing to talk with Ukraine. The subtext: sure, we can talk, but you have to pretend I haven't lost yet. The international community has caught wind of Russia's wavering and is jumping in with peace proposals. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is calling for an end to the war, and India is preparing to discuss peace initiatives with Moscow. Some military analysts are even suggesting that the world is pushing for a leadership shakeup in Russia. At the same time, Zelensky remains confident, vowing that Ukrainian forces will never retreat. It's now up to Russia to figure out how to handle the loss of Kursk. There may be more going on here, possibly connected to Zelensky's ceasefire proposal to Washington. The writing is on the wall, anti-war sentiment is growing in Russia, and the pro-war camp is losing steam. Recruitment is a nightmare, and the Kremlin is too scared to initiate a full-scale mobilization to be like digging their own grave. The U.S. saw the opportunity and bluntly told Russia to face reality: either keep wasting resources or get serious about negotiations. To help nudge things along, the U.S. has even started slowing down its aid to Ukraine. Congress may have approved billions in aid, but the funds have been trickling out at a painfully slow pace. At this rate, by the end of the fiscal year on September 30th, there could still be $6 billion left unspent. The reason? The U.S. might be in secret talks with Russia. If that money doesn't get spent in time, the whole aid package could be delayed or re-examined, and Zelensky has openly expressed his worries about this in recent press conferences. On the Ukrainian front, things are heating up. In early September, Ukrainian forces launched a counteroffensive in northern Kharkiv Oblast, pushing Russian troops out of towns like Lipsy, capturing a lot of Russian tanks and equipment. In the Kupiansk area, Russia attempted to cross the Oskil River, but Ukraine's 77th Airborne Brigade crushed them, inflicting heavy losses. Despite attempts to cut off Ukrainian supply lines, the Russians have barely made a dent, leaving Ukraine firmly in control in this region. In Donetsk, the situation is a bit trickier. In the north, near Toretsk, Russian forces launched several attacks from Shumy and Zaliz, but were repelled every time. Ukraine even recaptured New York on September 6th. Further south, near Pokrovsk and Avdiivka, the fighting is even more intense. Russian forces have been hammering areas like New Toretsk and Herdivka, but can't seem to hold their ground. Ukraine swiftly deployed elite units, including the Azov and Kardag brigades, to defend critical points like Saletov. Ukraine's 93rd Brigade's Signum Battalion has had impressive success, downing nearly 100 Russian drones in just a few days. But in the final 5 minutes, when Pokrovsk was on the verge of collapse, Zelensky magically deployed reinforcements. Why didn't he send them months ago? Was he saving them for some grand plan, or was it just bad management? In typical Ukrainian political fashion, these things will never be fully investigated. At the end of the day, it's Ukraine's own problem: a lack of transparency in military command and a habit of making critical decisions at the last minute. The northern front is holding steady, but down south, Russia has found a gap, advancing all the way to Ukraine's and Kalazanivka, nearly breaking through to Hernik. Ukrainian forces had to abandon their long-held positions on the eastern bank of the Vovosha River, something they'd rather keep quiet, though the Russians wasted no time boasting. Then again, the Russians aren't exactly flawless either. During the assault on Kurashevka, the 96th Motor Rifle Brigade managed to blow up several of their own vehicles. 10 days ago in Vuhledar, Ukraine's 72nd Mechanized Brigade was supposed to rotate out and let the 58th Motor Rifle take over, but the general staff dropped the ball and didn't send enough troops to fight armor, letting the Russians exploit the gap. After a decade of fighting, with 3 of those years being brutal, why hasn't Ukraine's general staff updated its operational doctrine? Commanders are still carelessly handling security, and rotations are still a mess. Remember Soledar in January 2023? Seems like those lessons didn't stick. Thankfully, Russia's focus on flattening Vuhledar has slowed to a crawl, with their soldiers stepping on landmines and making snail-like progress. These small tactical victories are being blown out of proportion by Russian propaganda, giving the false impression that Ukraine's defenses are on the brink of collapse. The message to the West is clear: Ukraine can't win. Russia's goal is obvious: undermine Western support and shake Ukraine's morale and resources. But here's the truth: Russia's slow. Grinding advance comes at a steep cost. Over 1,000 Russian soldiers are dying daily, and they need at least 30,000 new recruits every month. Even with promises of hefty bonuses, they can't keep up. If they resort to forced conscription, political unrest in Russia will skyrocket. Forget expanding their gains, just holding the line could become a serious problem. Meanwhile, Ukraine has been reshuffling its top officials in a major shakeup. Strategic Industries Minister Kimishin resigned, and Foreign Minister Kuleba also stepped down. Why all the changes? 2 main reasons. First, to inject fresh energy into the government and ensure smoother operations during wartime. Internal conflicts are the last thing they need. Second, some officials have been under immense pressure, working nonstop for over 2 years, and they genuinely need a break. Of course, there are also those who've been sidelined due to disagreements with Zelensky and his inner circle. Over in the USA, things are getting interesting. According to federal indictments, Russia spent just a mere $10 million to stir up a media storm in the UC. Their tactics weren't complicated: fund pro-Russian outlets to spread the narrative that supporting Ukraine is a waste of American taxpayer money. Even Trump got swept up in the hype, publicly questioning U.S. support for Ukraine. The most absurd part, Trump told Zelensky, "This is a war machine you're facing. That's what they do. They fight wars. They beat Hitler. They beat Napoleon." That's a complete misreading of history. Who helped defeat Napoleon and Hitler? Ukraine played a significant role. And let's not forget, Russia only won those wars because it had powerful allies like Britain and the US backing it. On its own, Russia wouldn't have fared so well. In reality, Russia has never been a true superpower. Their track record is far from glorious. They got thrashed by Japan in 1905, humiliated by Germany in World War I, and they struggled to suppress Chechnya in the 90s. The only time they could call themselves a superpower was after World War II, when they bullied Eastern Europe and turned the Soviet republics into vassal states. But since the collapse of the Soviet Union, with Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Moldova gaining independence, Russia's weaknesses have been laid bare. Today, Russia's economy is crumbling, its military operations are failing, and its political landscape is in chaos. Putin's invasion of Ukraine was nothing more than an attempt to restore Russia's great power status by bullying its neighbors. But now, the war has exposed Russia's fragile foundations. They can't even defeat Ukraine. Apart from a few like-minded authoritarian allies who really wants to stand by Russia's side now, their economy is in freefall, and frankly, if anyone still considers Russia a superpower, they're just fooling themselves. Despite some tactical victories, the bigger picture is clear: Russia is on the losing side. Anti-war sentiment within its leadership is growing louder, and Ukraine is preparing for the final stage of the conflict with a government reshuffle. Meanwhile, Russia is using money to sway U.S. public opinion, trying to weaken support for Ukraine. This final tug of war will be a true test of both countries' resilience.